Hello, I'm Robert, a voluntary fact checker and helping if you're scared of many things. And this is to help you with understanding what's happening with the Ukraine war. And it's extraordinarily positive what's happening in the last few weeks. But the negotiators themselves, they say not to pay too much attention to the mainstream news because there are lots of things that are being reported in the news that are not very accurate. And so it's much better to go closer to the source and this as close as one can get to what the negotiators themselves are saying. And that's what I do with my voluntary fact checks. And so the most extraordinary thing here, quite recent, what's really very positive thing, first of all, US is confident that Russia will agree to most of the of what they are working together with Europe and Ukraine on. And especially for security guarantees, this is really surprising Europe. And so I need to explain the security guarantees because this is what will help make sure that the war can't start up again. So that's extraordinarily important. So I'll start with talking about this idea to build a kind of mini NATO inside Ukraine, and that Russia this is something Russia supports. So that's according to Trump, and Trump says that he's spoken to Putin already, but he didn't give any details. But when he was asked by reporters, he just said, "Yeah, I have." When he was asked if he did that, if he'd been talking to Putin, and the Europeans plan to finalise their plan on the 15th to 16th. So that would be today's the 16th, and then the US will discuss it with Russia over the next few days. And then, if all goes well, the Ukrainians will meet with US negotiators perhaps as soon as this weekend. And that's to work through the remaining 10% of the things they can work on together. And setting up a leaders' meeting, at least between Zelensky and Trump. And then they will need to negotiate at the highest level to sort out the remaining things, which is about the territory of Donbass and the remaining area of Donbass. And that the Americans are saying that's got to be sorted out between the Ukrainians and the Russians. It's possible it might be that it'll have to be to the United States to go between, but at the very highest level, the issue there is that Putin might just refuse to talk to Zelensky. He has quite often, and he's kind of gone one way and the other on that. But he doesn't have to talk to Zelensky to end the war, actually. So we'll see what happens. The workarounds if he won't. And then they have to get over this whole territorial thing, working at the very highest level, ideally with Zelensky talking to Putin, if not through Trump. And then if that all works out, it's not impossible we could have it by the new year or sooner. So I need to explain this mini NATO, and Trump is so committed this time. He's just so involved with this. I can't see him pivoting back to turning against Ukraine anymore. I just can't see it now. So if Russia says no to this after all this work, then I think that the United States will just be putting pressure on Putin in various ways until he says yes. But it looks quite promising that Russia will say yes. So let's go and see why that is. So first of all, let's see this. Is that the right one? Yes, this is the situation we're in. It's quite a strange situation, so I just quickly summarize it in bullet points. So first of all, we are safe in NATO. And this is a very important thing to realize because people get scared. You shouldn't be scared. Ukraine wants to join NATO because it'll be safe if it's in NATO. So the obvious low-cost solution is for Ukraine to join NATO because it's all set up to deter Russia and to protect us from Russia. So why Ukraine? That'd be much lower cost because Ukraine's 800,000 strong army. That would be a huge addition to the European forces that are there that can be immediately very rapidly deployed to protect us. And then we would share the same defense systems. We wouldn't need to have duplicated defense systems in Ukraine and in the rest of NATO, and we could have the same, very much also things shared between the two countries, between over Ukraine, just like it is over all the NATO countries. And so why don't we do that? Well, because of that very reason, it'd be much lower cost and it would be very effective, and Putin doesn't want Ukraine to be in NATO. So Trump then told Ukraine he won't let Ukraine join NATO. And the reason is not because he wants NATO to be weaker, because he wants to get the deal done with Putin. So that's what led to all the complications here. So Ukraine needs security guarantees, and not just promises, because Russia's already invaded twice, and everyone agrees you can't just rely on a promise not to invade again. All the top negotiators, they agree. So, and even Russia understands that why Ukraine needs security guarantees. So what has happened is that US has basically promised to give Ukraine support it needs to set up a mini NATO inside Ukraine, with just the Ukrainian soldiers to protect the front line, but lots of support of equipment from its allies, and then some help from specialists and air and sea patrols from its allies. But basically, it's setting up that 800,000 strong army to hold back the whole of Russia. And so essentially, we're going to have two NATOs. We've got the NATO for everyone else, we've got the mini NATO for Ukraine. And there'll be some equipment shared between the two, but there's no fault of duplication between the two. And so this should reassure you that even Ukraine's mini NATO will be far stronger than Russia because of the technological advantage of NATO. And so Russia won't even think of attacking either Ukraine's mini NATO or NATO itself. So this makes no military or economic sense, but it's the only reason to do this is because Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, and it's very odd in international law. A country is free to join any security alliance that it thinks will keep it safe, and any security alliance is free to accept any country that needs its help under international law. This is actually written into international law, those 2 points. So it's very odd for NATO to say, well, we're not going to accept Ukraine because Putin, which has nothing to do with this security alliance, says no. There's no military reason, there's no legal reason, there's no economic reason for that. It's just because they want to get a deal with Putin, and Putin is insisting that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. So that's why they have to set up a mini NATO, mini Ukraine inside NATO. So now let's go to back to the start of the page. So that's explained the mini NATO. I think I'll do about 20 minutes, and then if I haven't finished by then, I'll do an extra video to keep going. So with that background, then this is what US has said, and so this is from former Voice of America correspondent, who I found to be very accurate. And so US believes they can get Russia to agree to the security guarantees, and Europe and Ukraine are very surprised to hear that. They, on frozen assets, they seem to be getting closer together, but they don't say what was agreed. And on territory, that's left to the final negotiations. And then the various other details. Russia's okay with Ukraine joining the EU, and Trump is committed to making sure that Russia won't expand any further west. So that is a new line here, that he doesn't want, and he doesn't want to put pressure on Zelensky on territorial issues, he says. And he wants to make sure that it really ends, that Ukraine has a bright and prosperous future, and he wants Russia to get back in the global economy, so he has the incentive not to get back to war in the future. That's Trump's point of view. And he believes 90% of the issues are solved. So that's the US side, which is very positive. Now we're going to look at the Ukrainian side. And now here, what happens is that the only person who can really give a very well-informed view from the Ukrainian side is Zelensky, because he is the final decision maker on everything, just like Trump is on the US side. And even his chief negotiators, they couldn't actually make concessions. The news sometimes would say that Umerov has made this concession or that concession. He can't. He doesn't have that capability. So Zelensky is the one who's, in Ukrainian law, is able to do things like that. He is the one who's responsible for foreign policy. So what has been new this time is that Zelensky, he is being extraordinary for this kind of a peacefire negotiation where usually everything is extremely secret until the end. Zelensky has been extraordinarily open about what's been going on. And he, partly I think, in order to overturn all these inaccuracies that are being, and these false rumours. And Zelensky is very aware, I think, that his English it's pretty good, but he's not fluent in English. And he's sometimes he's quite often indeed, been misrepresented when he's done interviews with English-speaking interviewers. And then he's come out of that and he's found that the news has misrepresented what he said. So what he's been doing for the last few days, when it's so sensitive and so important for things to be accurate, he talks in Ukrainian to Ukrainian-speaking journalists. And the Ukrainian-speaking journalists then, they will translate his responses into English, and they can ask questions in Ukrainian, they get answers in Ukrainian via WhatsApp. And it's all sound clips, there's no video, and none of it's in English. So this is the best source that there is, and it's best source on both sides because he tells us much more than the US side do on what's been going on. So this is the very best source we have on what's been going on. And so he's spoken to Trump directly. He's spoken to Witkoff and Kushner, and the European leaders and Zelensky discussed all the steps that he's been. So if you don't know, Zelensky for the last few couple of days has been in Berlin talking with European leaders mainly about the security guarantees, and they've sorted out and hammered out the security guarantees. Now he says he doesn't yet have consensus on the territorial issues, but this is the idea of a free economic zone between the Russian front line and the edge of Donbass. And the Russians have been insinuating that this, or suggesting that this would be under the control of the Russian Rosguardia, the Russian military police. And Zelensky has said a firm no to that. And he says a free economic zone does not mean control by the Russian Federation. So that is the main thing. He's saying he's not going to recognize this as de jure by law, definitely not. But he's not going to recognize it de facto. In other words, he's not going to accept a situation where the Russian military police are in charge of the area that the Ukrainians now control. So that's the Ukrainian red line. But there's a lot of flexibility within that. So he's going, that's to be sorted out at the end at the highest level. He talks about how they seem quite optimistic. He seems quite optimistic he's going to get it sorted out. So now, if we go and look at the rest of this, first of all, the funding, quite a lot of that's been sorted out. And he's talked about, for instance, just replacing lost homes for people whose homes were destroyed. It's going to cost $70 to $80 billion. Destroy all the homes of Ukrainians that Russians have destroyed during this invasion. The $70 to $80 billion worth of homes that the Russians have destroyed. And he also wants to restore infrastructure, schools, universities, energy systems. And there's one very expensive thing he didn't mention, which is demining large areas of, it's about a quarter of the Ukrainian territory is now minefields. And demining is quite an expensive operation. So you have to demine large areas of Ukraine as well. So that's, he says that if the war stops now, then all the 200 billion of the Russian frozen assets, then that would be put towards and this is something that is built into law, the international law, that if a country invades and it's wronged the country that's invaded by destroying things there, then the invaded country can seek internationally compensation for all the damage that was caused. So Europe is actually in pretty good state in international law in actually freezing the frozen assets. What is not permitted under international law is to use those assets for defence against the invader. There's nothing written about that in international law. So if the war stops now, then it'll be very, very clear and simple that that the Europeans will just say Russia's got to pay such and such in more reparations. Russia will say, no, we're not going to pay that. And then Europeans will say, okay, well, we've got these frozen assets, we'll use that for the war reparations. And the amount you should pay is a bit more than that, so we're safe doing that. And then legally they would be in good status if they do that. So that's the basic idea of the frozen assets. But then if the war continues and Russia says no, then they would have to find quite a lot of money each year, and that gets a little bit more tricky. But hopefully we don't get to that. And setting that against the frozen assets is not such a legally secure thing at all. So that's why you get a lot of discussion of that. But it'll all be by the way if we do get a ceasefire quickly. So when it comes to strong security guarantees, then this is actually going to be a vote in Congress. So if it was just a promise by Trump, then it wouldn't be so strong, because the next president might just not even agree with the promise and not keep to it. But if it is actually passed as a law in Congress, and it can be passed, either Congress could ratify a treaty which requires a 2/3 majority, or they could in Senate, or they could pass a law of some sort in order to restrict future presidents to make sure that they do agree with the security guarantees. Then that would put Ukraine in a very strong position. So Ukraine doesn't want something like the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which was kind of vague promises from the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, to support it if it was invaded, and they didn't really do, especially at the start of the war, they did very little to stop it. And later on, European and US did more. But Ukraine wants something very, very clear that will immediately come in right at the start if Ukraine tries to invade again. And so that's why he wants a vote in Congress. And then, now let's see a few more things. The Americans say it's 90% done, so that's Ukraine, that's Zelensky confirming that the Americans say it's 90% done. That's Zelensky confirming that from his side. He talked about elections and referendums. There'll be at least a 90-day ceasefire needed in order to do that. So he says he's ready for elections, but they must be legitimate. And in order to have a legitimate elections, they need security. And so he needs a 60 or 90-day ceasefire, which needs to be coordinated with Russia in order to have elections. This is the idea of a Christmas ceasefire. I think Russia's already said no to that. It's not surprising, because the Russian Christmas Day is the 7th of January, so they don't celebrate it on the same day anyway. Right, so now we've been through most of this. Now, if they don't work, then that's plan B, is to continue the war and just continue defending from against the Russian invasion, and that's quite an expensive option. And then there's the deterrence package. The deterrence package for after the war has ended involves 800,000 Russian soldiers, and then it involves the European leaders and the United States supporting Ukraine to maintain an army of 800,000, which is quite a large army, with the weapons, the equipment, strength and training, and funding, so they're ready immediately if there's any risk of an invasion again. So these security guarantees look very, very strong. And here's the Umarov saying, please don't fall for rumours and speculations. He's been one of the people who has been frequently misreported by the mainstream media. So yeah, that's all that. Now I'll just quickly do the leader summary, and then I'll talk in the next section about something else, which may be, so yes, consensus European leaders statement, that's where the 800,000 and these other details come from that I just mentioned. So they're to remain at 800,000 in peacetime, supported by the European allies. And this is a consensus statement that all the European leaders have signed, and they put on their government websites. There's one on the UK government website, there's one on the EU website, all saying the identical same thing. So they're going to be regeneration of the Ukrainian forces, securing the skies, safer seas, and there's going to be some operation in Ukraine that's likely involves air and sea patrols. That's my comment, far from the front line, and supporting the training of the Ukrainian forces and so on. The US is going to give early warning of attacks and assistance in deconfliction and ceasefire monitoring, and then legally binding commitments of various sorts, which presumably are going to be spelled out later, and to invest in the future prosperity of Ukraine, so major resources available to recover and reconstruction, like rebuilding all those homes that Russia has destroyed, and beneficial trade agreements, and sovereign assets immobilized to be used to help to reconstruct Ukraine. So European leaders and the United States, they're all agreed on that now, and strongly support Ukraine to join the EU. And so this is how Trump said, I think we're closer now than we've have been ever. We're having tremendous support from European leaders. They want to get it ended also. And the Associated Press, this thing about a time limit on security guarantees, and Trump says, some officials have suggested a time limit. Trump says there's no time limit. So he's not pressurizing them. It's just how long it takes to get it done. And once it's done, it's done. So that's extraordinarily positive. I hope you agree. And I think, it's not a deal. The deal is not a deal until it's a deal, as it were. It's not done until it's done. But it's extremely close. And it all depends on it really depends on Putin. And as you've seen, Trump is Trump seems extremely confident that Putin's going to agree to this. So he says that almost all of it they've already agreed to. And I expect the territorial thing will be a difficult thing with final negotiations and what exactly happens in the rest of Donbass. And that might be the most difficult thing, but if they get everything else sorted and they get to that point, then there'll be very strong pressure on both Russia and Ukraine to find a solution to that. So that is the situation. It looks extremely positive. Certainly most positive it's ever been since the war started, and it's most positive since Russia invaded Crimea. The Minsk 1 and 2 agreements were nothing like this. There's never been anything like this since. And the Budapest Memorandum...
4 p.m.
Oh dear, that thing that said... I should switch that off. The Budapest Memorandum, the Budapest Memorandum looked like it was the answer for Ukraine back in 1994, but it turned out it wasn't. But this seems very secure and very, very strong. See if they can get it across the line. So if this works, the Ukraine war will end, and it can never start up again. So it'd be a complete... And Ukrainians want this war to end, not just for them, but for their children's generation, this generation's grandchildren's generation, all the way through to their old age. They want it just to be completely ended right into the indefinite future. And it looks as if this may well be what they achieve. So that is why, as I say, it looks extremely positive. Now, I'm just going to look at this. Why would it be that Russia is agreeing to all this? What has changed? And so, that's what I want to talk about in the next little bit. And so that'll be in my next video. And I've already talked about some of it. I'll just summarize and I'll go through the rest of this page and some of the things in the rest of this page about that.